I also want to say I'm also at UCL, and I'm a meditation researcher at UCL. So this comes from a place of a real interest in potentially collaborating on some of this. Because I disagree with Thomas. I don't think the self is an illusion, but I also disagree with you. And I think there could be helpful conceptual space here to dig more deeply into some of these Buddhist constructs and pick up a concept such as neither real nor not real, which would be like a shorthand, definition of emptiness. What does it mean for a thing to be empty? Well, it depends on your way of looking. And in, if you really sign up to Thomas's framework, and that's what I sort of alluded to in my reply to Nicholas earlier, that the self is really an illusion. This will probably affect your perception if you run with this construct of neither real nor not real. But if you think the self is really real, well, that probably affects your perception of your very self as well. So I would be curious if we use that construct and the other construct of not getting bogged down in is the self real or not, but start by using it as a spectrum. We know we can have states of hatred, of really solidified senses of self and other, and we know days where things are flowing quite smoothly after coffee in the morning, and it's just there's more lightness around the sense of self. Some people in the room might have explored meditation, and some of them, and I work with people with some expert meditators who've in our study have meditated more than 10,000 hours. Some of them have spent 10 years on retreat, so really rather exceptional individuals. And I could contrast this quote to people saying, trying to make sense of a full cessation experience, when it's not even that just objects didn't arise anymore, but not even a sense of awareness. And I think we could also have a really interesting discussion about psychedelics and some of the assumptions there, because there's a part of me that just feels that we need more practice and people who commit to long retreats and to not arrest the inquiry too early, to say something like, I had an ego death experience. Because when you talk to these people sometimes, it's like, is it that just your general sense of self on the spectrum was a bit less identified, and maybe your identification shifted to awareness, and now you sign up for Ramana Maharshi Advaita Vedanta framework, or whatever Eckhart Tolle video you've come across, which is great and can be so helpful, but can we approach it with more curiosity, with more intelligence, with more playfulness? Exactly. That's sort of my response.
Thank you so much for that question. I actually have 2 points on that. So, and it's kind of connected with why I want to develop this network. With basically, I want to collaborate with artists and performers to create different type of expression, right? Because the only thing, the only tool that we have right now is English language. And we have a problem with language, and we have a problem with English language, right? We know that basically when you want to express a state of mind or an experience, first of all, when you express it, you already hinder it, right? It's like, because it's like you break the flow, right? We all know that, right? So when you try to put a experience into words, that in itself kind of like, hinders the experience, right? So I wonder, as you said, it's like whether we can develop different ways of actually expressing with like playfulness, kind of like movement, art, multisensory type of like experience, because I suspect that basically people maybe they will actually connect with each other more quickly, right? They will just, oh, I know what you mean, right? Rather than just like when you try to, because I struggled a bit when I started to exchange with people suffering from depersonalization in the first place, because I realized that the vocabulary that I was using didn't mean anything to them. It's like, on the contrary, it's like, well, it's like too complicated. What do you mean, right? But then if you lower down that kind of like cognitive involvement, like putting concepts in kind of like boxes, and try to find different way of like mapping these experiences, then the communication flows more easily, right? Another thing that we're kind of like trying to develop is, again, based on this idea that what is really fundamental is the experience of connectedness, the sharedness. We do not come into this world alone. And actually, if we are alone, immediately after birth, we die. So we are fundamentally and necessarily depending upon others, right? Whether we like it or not. problem is like when you start to investigate certain things, we're already adult individuals, and we might have this illusion that actually I'm just like solitary atom, right? And I can see everything from this kind of like solitary atomistic perspective. But that's actually, again, as I said, it's like ignoring the roots of the tree, right? It's like you don't see the phenomena as it is. It's just like what you kind of like see right now. It's very, what I really want is like, I'd like to delve deeper into this kind of like hidden roots, so to speak. But this means that we have to widen up a bit the conceptual toolbox that we have, which is right now very rigid, as coming just from one perspective, and to understand this phenomena more flexibly, so to speak. And I think we have something to gain, not to lose, from kind of like diversifying our conceptual toolbox. And I totally agree with you. I believe that the concept that you just mentioned is neither that, not that. It's not that, it's not that. It's like not real, not unreal. It's like, and we don't have a concept for that, right? But we have the feeling. We know what when you told me, I understand what you mean, right? It's like this kind of like, okay, I'm in between somehow, right?
Yeah, on that actually, when you were talking and now when you repeat this reminds me of this quote by Berkeley: "To be is to be perceived." Also in connection of what is perception, what is experience. So maybe we actually tend to define what is real by what we perceive, and then compare to what we have perceived before in order to judge what has changed. But as you said, maybe what has changed is very little in comparison to the spectrum that is actually possible, right? So yeah, well. Okay, who was first? There are 3 hands. Okay. First, you.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was really nice. I wanted to ask you, because the last remarks that you made sort of reminded me of the whole attachment framework by Fonagy and all. And I know that this whole like psychoanalytical, psychodynamic frameworks have been neglected a lot by in the scientific community, but it felt like you're sort of making a reference to it, or maybe it's just me taking it from that way, like the whole tactile experience, pre-verbal, and the experience and the perception, and how an infant sort of gains the sense of self through the perception of the caretaker, and then experiences it, and then gains a sense of self through this process. Like, what do you think of this whole theory, and do you think it's sort of related to what you've been explaining?
So actually, one of my collaborators in London, Katerina Fotopoulou, did her PhD thesis with Peter Fonagy, and she's very much into this line of work. I'm taking a different perspective. I start with observation, right? I'm not committed to psychodynamics, subpsychoanalysis, and any of that. I just want to start with the facts, right? And one fact is that regardless of like the theories that we have across the ages or across the schools, whatever, there is a fact, right? This is how we are born, right? Now, I think they have a point. So I think they're right in pointing to that direction, right? I don't buy into the story. I don't buy into because for other reasons. Actually, I can share with you why I don't buy into the reason. I'd like to remind you, all of you, that until 100 years ago, women weren't allowed to go to university. So this means that the entire conceptual toolbox that we have up to now has been designed through a single viewpoint, right? And this means that this is why Plato doesn't even bother with the problem of pregnancy. Was like how people come into the world, whatever. It's like it's not a problem for him, right? So take the mind-body problem for a pregnant woman. How many bodies, how many minds you have there? It's like, and if you go through the history of philosophy, you don't have that, right? There's nothing, right? It's like, yeah. So I'd like to ask you to bear that in mind, namely that the entire conceptual toolbox that we have developed is coming just from one lens, right? I don't want to say that lens is wrong. I'm just trying to say this is incomplete, right? It's missing something, right? And this is what we want to pinpoint to say, hey, how about this, right? And the problem with this kind of like attachment theory is that, again, they are developed by men. right? And they have a point. I mean, okay, so this is how they see it, but we need to actually look at it from the other perspective as well. And I think we literally need to bear in mind that it's how important is this experience of sharedness. And going back to depression, right? If you have a depressing friend, I had once a depressive friend. I went to his home and I want to cheer him up to make him feel good. And I was putting, you know, joyful songs, right? And my friend was even more depressed, right? As I wanted to take it out from that kind of like, oh, Lou, let's do this. It was like joyful activity. And one day I said, you know what? Because I had a rejection or something like that. So I also feel a bit low. So I went to her and said, okay, let's hear a sad song together, right? So we put a sad song together and basically we said, yeah. And that simple feeling of like my feeling being of her feeling of sadness being shared, that already made it feel better. It's not the content of the expression that we have, it's like why, the fact that, okay, so you get me, right? It's like, this is how I feel. You feel sad, this is how I feel. And why going back, it's important to go back to the infancy, is because remember that infants cannot see themselves. It's like, okay? So if I cry, I don't know, some of you are probably parents, but if you have an infant crying in your arms, what do? If you are an experienced parent, you do what I did with my friend. It's like try to smile at him. And if I smile at a crying baby, try to do that and see if he starts crying. He won't stop crying. He will cry even more. He'll say, why you don't get it? I'm sad. Why are you smiling at me, right? But if you make this the face of like, you know, it's like, okay, I understand this, you know, I say, oh, okay, you got me. No, I'm sad. So the important thing is the infant feels understood and met, right? It's like, okay, so you got what I'm going through. And that feeling of sharedness is very important because it comes again from the roots I told you, right? There's an ontological dependence upon another human being, which is there from the very beginning. And I think that is deeply rooted. And I think, yes, they're right in the attachment theory. And I believe that they have just one-sided, and then Freud took it in. But I wouldn't like to throw the baby with the bathwater. There's some good points in that. I think they're right to put the spotlight. Okay, let's start with the square one, right? But not. But again, let's remember that the lens that we're using is just like partial, and we need to actually more. And basically, what I said about the universities, but you need to remember that people in, I don't know, South America, some tribes, they also have a sense of self, right? And we don't know how they feel. We don't know because they have very little actually literature on this, right? And comparison with different diverse perspectives. So we have a lot of work to do just to get rid of like that kind of like very narrow lens that we look at the problem of consciousness.
Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I have a general question. So I really liked how in your talk you sort of connected James's experience and a non-ordinary state of consciousness, such as the depersonalization disorder, to draw conclusions about the importance of the self and a first-person perspective for our ordinary consciousness. So I guess my general question is, to what extent can we study altered states and non-ordinary states and psychiatric symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions to draw conclusions about ordinary states and about how our normal states of consciousness, perceptions, beliefs, and so on normally work, and what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for them that still persist, and what instead can be altered and how?
Yeah, actually, I think that's one of the most promising, and this is why I also believe that you know, the approach with psychedelics is very important, because what you do with psychedelics, you transform and you change. Basically, you play with the transparency of the window, right? And then you and when you have alteration, you can actually see things differently, and you have different perspective. Otherwise, it's like just like take it for granted. You don't know, is that right? It's like, I don't know, you have something like in the background in your house, you don't pay attention to it, and one day it disappears. And oh, there was something there that was important. I'm kind of disturbed. And I think that's something very promising. Is like basically we play with the changing and transformation that we have in our sense of self. And there will be a call for papers. I haven't put it here, but we're going to edit a special issue in the Philosophical Transaction of the Royal Society journal. And the title is actually, I kind of like cheated a bit because I took the first two words from it's again, lost and found. Right? So you lose something, but you gain something else. That's the basic idea. So you don't lose your sense of self, you just found it in a different form. And the full title is Lost and Found, Mapping Changes in the Sense of Self from Mechanism to Phenomenology. Right? So instead of looking at a self, okay, we realize that the self is not a entity, it's not an atom, it's something that changes, right? It's something that can be transformed, and how we can map this type of changes, like through different substances, like alteration, like sleep, like when you're dizzy, and actually that gives you the fuller, richer picture, rather than say, okay, so you have the conscious experience, and that's the consciousness is, and then you have some disorders, and we have to treat them, right? Because that's bad and that's good, right? I think it's on the contrary, it's like we can learn a lot of things on ourselves. And again, I think somebody said at a certain point about prevention, how good it is, right? We are never, we're never 100% sure that we're going to be healthy all the time. Maybe, I don't know, tomorrow I'm going to be very, very depressed. Or I don't know, if I'm going to try again cannabis, I'm going to get depersonalized. So, who knows?
It's quite a short one. I'm just curious on your exchange you had with Metzinger on the topic, because looking into Metzinger, he seems to say that the self is an illusion continuously, but at the same time he uses the notion of minimal self at points, and I find quite difficult to understand how he integrates the minimal self in that framework, and I find quite difficult with that if he agrees with the subjectivity principles of consciousness, and maybe there's something that came out of the personal discussions on that topic.
Yeah, so I had a slide on a different talk on something, right? What exactly, again, this is a huge topic. What do you mean by minimal self? So he has a very different approach. He basically takes whatever is common in all your conscious experience, and that's the minimal, right? It's kind of like the structure, right, of a conscious experience. I disagree with that. I believe that minimal is, in my sense, it's like whatever fetuses have in the womb, right? For me, that's minimum. It's like the basic is like up, down. It's not taking whatever you have, like here an experience, like full flow, flat, and try to figure out what is the basic, the necessary condition of the structure to be conscious at time t, when you're an adult, will not give you what is minimal. It will give you, I don't know, something like a backbone or something. But backbone doesn't mean minimal, doesn't mean the basis, right? It's like, it's a structure, right? And I agree with him in the sense where that's something that we have access to, because we're adults and we can clearly access that. And we don't have this type of recollection and that type of access with babies, right? Just kind of like have to speculate whatever's happening there, right? And this is why I think it's important, the new approaches that people have there. There's a group in Tübingen working on this. It's like they do studies on pregnant women, and they run a couple of battery of tests. It's like multisensory, how it's MEG study. So how the brain responds to different stimuli, blah, 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 if they kind of learn or not learn. So it's a way to gather indirect information about what is going on there. Obviously, we don't have access to whatever is happening.
I would like to sharpen the question a bit more and more specifically ask, in your understanding of Metzinger, does he agree with Sahavi and the minimal self or the mindness, or does his kind of definition fall outside of that?
Yeah. So they disagree. It's a very different approach. Dan Zahavi sees the minimal self as and he agrees with this idea that the minimal self is necessarily body self, right? It's like the minimal body. It's not the case with Thomas Metzinger, because for him the minimal self and the minimal phenomenal selfhood is necessarily connected to the mental state, right? So that's already a big disagreement. I think I put one of the quotes in one of my slides. He basically, for Zahavi, the minimal self is the subject, the necessarily subject of an experience, right? But it's not the, again, I had this argument with Thomas Metzinger many times about if you put the label phenomenal, minimal phenomenal doesn't solve the problem. Just like, that's it, yeah.
Okay, we can take one more question in order to be kind of in time, or two very quick questions, because I'm seeing a lot of hands. Okay.
You said that touch enables you to be self-conscious, and I was wondering whether you can think of other bodily measures besides touch, what you would use, because I was thinking of these like floating tanks where the water has the body temperature of yours, so you don't really feel a lot, and also you don't hear. And
yeah, but I don't believe. I had this kind of like objection many times. Say, oh, okay, the self is rooted in the body, but what about the sensory deprivation? Take the sensory out. Well, you maybe take out the exteroceptive system, yeah, but you can't take out. you're still breathing. Sorry. So by breathing, you're regulating homeostasis, and then your belly is like, whether you like it or not, is going to move. And this means that you still have movements in yourself, right? And you have the senses from within. It's not a sensory deprivation. If you are sensory deprived, you're dead, right? This is like a full sense. It's like, yes, you take away some senses, the external ones, right? But you still have, it's like, if you're hungry, your bowels will still, make noise. You cannot control them. Maybe some meditators can, but I believe that even very experienced meditators, they still need to breathe. Right? Yeah.
Thank you.
And you pass it to Bas over there for a very short and closing question.
Yeah, well, when you said, when you mentioned the crack in the window, I thought you meant the ego by that. So I thought like the ego can distort, like in the Buddhist conception, the ego distorts reality. It's kind of a solidified conception of the self, so not the real self. But my question was, do you think that mental illness is often caused by seeing oneself too much as an object and not trusting subjective experience enough?
No, what is cracked is not the ego.
Yeah,
right?
Okay.
It's because remember the snowball metaphor that I told you. It's like these people know very well that I here is I there, so there's a a full awareness. Actually, one of the paper I'm writing on depersonalization has this title: I overthink, therefore I'm not, because I think overthinking disrupts the sense of reality. If you think too much, then you lose the immersion into reality, and this is why you feel unreal. So you need to stop thinking. It's one of the problems with people with depersonalization. They highly observe and they want to understand what's going on with them. They go deeper into observation, blah, blah, blah. And I keep telling them, because some of them, they become my friends, I said to stop thinking. Just like do things in the world, just like gardening, swimming, whatever. And one of them actually is starting to feel better after 1 month, for just like stop thinking, right? That kind of like reflecting way, right? So I don't think, I think the problem is like they over objectify themselves because they want to understand what is going on with them. And by doing this, they kind of disrupt the subjectivity of the experience. And the basic way to actually get back to the subject is to go back to the roots, and the roots are bodily, and potentially shared. If you're lucky enough to share it actually with someone that actually the flow goes. Because one of the problems is like, for better or for worse, we depend on others. And the causes of our sometimes disorders come from mistreatment from others, right? So you need to be very careful with whom basically you have this interaction and which type of environment. Because if you treat the patient and then you put him back in the environment that actually took him there in the first place, then it's like you lost your time. So basically you need to see how that self interacts with his environment and with others necessarily, and then, you know, treat the relations, not just one individual. Thank you.